Hello and welcome to the third of our end-of-week summaries for William Wordsworth Poetry, People and Place. I'm delighted that this week I'm joined again by my fellow educators, Sally Bushell and Jeff Cowton. So this week we've been at the tumultuous brook of Greenhead Gill, and we've also been in the Jerwood Centre, and we've been thinking about Wordsworth's magnificent poem, Michael. We've very much again enjoyed reading through your comments and getting your responses to the poem, and been very struck, I think, by how strong those responses have been, not only in intellectual terms, but also in emotional terms, something that I think we'll talk about. People have also been very interested in the politics of the poem and in Wordsworth as a political poet, so we'll be covering that too. Another nice element of all the work you've done this week has been the sense of personal reflection, and once again we've got a fantastic Padlet mosaic of your poems and images, and also in the comments a number of people reflecting on the importance of place for them, so thank you for those too. And as I said, I think in each of the weeks so far we've been really pleased at the sense of community that we're feeling on the MOOC. I mean, thanks to our two mentors, Andrew and Frank, but thanks to you all for the support for each other and for the links you've provided and the resources you've suggested, and also the encouragement people are giving to each other. It's really nice to see. And as a number of people have commented, it's especially nice in these difficult times where we can't always travel where we want to travel and meet the people we'd like to meet. So thank you all for that. So Sally and Jeff, great to see you both. Thank you very much for joining us. As I say, probably the most striking thing about the responses this week has been the sense of what an emotional experience reading and engaging with Michael has been. I mean, Sally, perhaps if I go to you first, I mean, do you share that sense of the power of this poem?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always been one of my favourite poems, actually, and still is. I remember reading it. I've read it by myself and cried at the end of the poem, and as you know, you and I both know, Simon, we've both got sons, and I've got an adopted son, and we've done that walk with the students, and had a sort of a deeply embarrassing moment, but also, you know, it's good to have deeply embarrassing moments. So yes, we definitely had that experience where I was reading it and I broke down. I couldn't continue reading, and I'm very pleased to say that I sort of, Simon, you'll have to. And Simon's like, I don't know if I can. And you know, I think it was just overwhelming. And I think for me, it's partly because it's actually quite a simple story, and it's so sort of stark and it's so unfair. It just feels so unfair, and you don't want that outcome to happen. But it's also very much about the relationship of Michael and Luke, which I think is really beautifully portrayed, and maybe quite unusual to have a relationship between. I mean, you know more about masculinity and roles of masculinity than I do, but it's a very almost like maternal. The relationship's so touching and moving, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Wordsworth makes a point, doesn't he, of saying that Luke performs, you know, the kinds of tasks that you might expect of a mother. So as well as being this, you know, in some ways heroic, hard-working, strong, powerful figure, he also has that, as you say, that strong sense of a tenderness that we start a sort of unarticulated tenderness. I think that we start to feel. As you say, it's a very powerful human story, isn't it? And I mean, the word that just always strikes me when I think about it is loss, isn't it? You know, I think as you say in the film, you know, what he's hoping to do is keep his son and keep his land. He loses both. And as a result, he seems to have lost his sense of purpose, even his sense of identity. You know, that terribly sad image at the end of him sitting by the unbuilt sheepfold is, yeah, it is kind of, it's a heartbreaking moment. And I think as well as I mean, one of the interesting things I think about the comments this week is quite a lot of people have been interested in form and in the kind of the rhythm of the poetry. So Frank, thanks to Frank, has done some great work explaining what iambic pentameter is to people, which I won't reproduce here. But I think, you know, one of the striking things is this, as you say, simple story of country folk, as it were, being presented in the language and the rhythm that previously was associated with Shakespeare's dramas, associated with Milton's Paradise Lost, gives a terrific sense of grandeur to the poem that reinforces the sense of the emotional power. I mean,
yeah,
sorry,
well, of course, what's interesting as well is how different that is from the earliest version, which is that very sing-songy, ballad. So yeah, really, a great decision, shall we say, by Wordsworth to switch to blank verse.
Yeah.
But also, of course, that Wordsworth uses blank verse in a very distinctive way. So I was responding to someone and saying it's actually very readable. If you read it aloud, it reads very, very smoothly and easily. So he does take blank verse and do something different with it from what Milton does. It isn't, although it's a high form, he does still, he makes it much more like speech. I think someone said, how is this poetry? Is this poetry? And I thought it was really interesting. Well, it is, but it's so smooth and so fluent that it actually turns blank verse into something very close to speech.
And one of the things a number of learners have commented on is how good Keith Hanley, our colleague's reading of it is. He does read it extremely well, I think. We're very grateful to him. Jeff, you're obviously a resident of Grasmere and live, probably about 800 yards away from Greenhead Gill. I mean, do you still have the sense of the power of the poem? Is that something you share, or is the fact you live so close to it just defamiliarize it for you?
Not at all. And it's a place we often walk. It's a place that you can separate yourself from Grasmere in, as you both know. You do turn that corner and you do come across a hidden valley, and it can seem like a very different place. And I've had that cry moment. Mine was on a train, by the way, so don't read Michael on a train. It's in my role, as you can imagine, people often say, well, I'd like to know Wordsworth a bit better. Which poem should I start with? Well, Michael, for all the reasons you've said, its readability, its familiarity of story and experience, it's a great one to start with. I've had a family in Grasmere. 3 sons have grown up here. They've become rooted in the place. And what I take from it too is also that sense of, I don't know, I was going to say like solidity. That's the wrong word really, but there's such a firmness about that covenant. When they're together in that shared experience. And if ever you come across difficult times, think of this place, think of this moment. And when my middle son got married, I thought, well, they met in Grasmere, their roots are in Grasmere, and I went to the river and I found a stone, and because of the shape of the sheepfold, the shape of a heart unequally divided, I did my best to find a heart. It was very appropriate for the wedding, and I asked the calligrapher to put their initials on it, and that was like a covenant, if you like, between them and the place and their beginnings, to put on the mantelpiece, so that should rocky times come or difficult days, as they do, just to think back to something a bit more, a good foundation, you might say. So it's a wonderful poem, isn't it? And a wonderful setting.
That's a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing that with us, Jeff. Is it still on the mantelpiece?
It's still on the mantelpiece, and they're still together.
Part of the pathos, I guess, of Michael is this sense that that stone in effect has lost its meaning in the story of Michael. Yet Wordsworth at the start of the poem still understands the meaning, and he says he's going to show us this little rock which looks like it has no meaning, and explain the meaning, which is again part of the poignancy, isn't it? That so much has been invested in it, as in yours, but that has gone. It's very interesting you mentioned the word covenant here, because I wanted to ask Sally about this, because I know she's thought a lot about this. People have been very interested in the religious overtones of Michael and in the biblical parallels, and there are great comments people will be able to read there. A couple of people specifically asking about the idea of the covenant, which conceptually is quite difficult. So I'll just hand over to you then, Sally, and see if you can help us out with precisely what a covenant means and how is Wordsworth using that concept.
Yes, so I've written a whole paper on this many years ago, and I delved back into my folders on my computer yesterday, somewhere way back in 2009, I think, and luckily managed to find a document called Michael's Covenant that had all my notes on it, which was fantastic. So thank God for that, because I had forgotten that. Anyway, what I told myself back in 2009 was there's two really key covenants between God and man, and the first of those is Noah and the rainbow. So he says, I'll establish my covenant with you, having flooded the world and destroyed everyone. I'll send a rainbow to say I'm not going to do it again. So he does that. That's a covenant between him and the earth, natural covenant, obviously. And then the second one, which obviously is more directly pertinent to Michael, is between God and Abraham, where he says, I will make my covenant between me and thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. So God's covenant is with Abraham, but for all his descendants as well. And that covenant is actually to say, I'm going to read it because it's easier. Ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. So what he says is, I make a covenant with you and your people, and so long as you circumcise yourselves, we'll both know who you are. That's essentially what he said. And so it concerns Abraham and the land and the future race. So this is where it gets really complicated, is that at that point he introduces a token. So you have the covenant, which is the bond, but you also have a token of the covenant, which in this case is circumcision. And the same with the rainbow. The rainbow is not the covenant, it is the token of the covenant. So it's like a symbol that is standing for the bond. That's then the question with the sheepfold then is it a covenant or is it a token of a covenant? And that's, in a way, that's what happens. So what we also see in that, in all of God's covenants, is they're very one-sided. You don't have Noah saying, oh, I'd quite like to come to an agreement with you. God sets down, this is it, and I'm choosing to make it. It's a very one-sided affair. And a covenant it should really be a mutual agreement, but it can be a one-sided agreement. So again, we see that in a sense we see that in Michael, or at least that's where the problems happen, if you like. So in a one-sided covenant, how do you know that the other person has agreed to it? I mean, Luke doesn't say, yes, Dad, I'm taking it all on board. He sobs, he stands there, he cries, so they cry. But it's Michael who set the term. So it's actually, Michael is very one-sided about it. It's like, and Michael, what Michael says is, I want this to be the covenant. And he says, a work which is not here, hasn't yet built it, a covenant, 'twill be between us. So actually a covenant that hasn't yet been created between us. And it's basically saying to make sure that you do come safely back. But it's totally one-sided. So in effect, what then happens is, it negates itself. So instead of functioning as a covenant, it functions as a token of a covenant, like a symbol to Luke of what he should be doing, and it actually has the effect to push him further away. It doesn't. So I think the force of it and what Michael wants it to stand for is so strong. What you were talking about, Jeff, the sort of rootedness and the anchor, but it's so strong that when he can't live up to that, or he feels he's failed his father, it, instead of pulling him in, it pushes him further out. And then of course you're left, you haven't ever got the covenant because you only had Michael making it one-sidedly, and you haven't even actually got the token of the covenant because you've only got a few bits of stone. You haven't in fact even got a sheepfold, so you sort of lose everything. Does that make any sense at all? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it brings out the sort of the personal dynamics of the poem very much, and as you say, might make us think about the figure of Luke as well, and his role within the whole poem. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Amazing.
Yeah, great to have perhaps the world's leading expert on Wordsworth and covenants giving us the benefits of her research there. I mean, I guess one of the other elements that generates the power of Michael is the sense of a lost way of life. That this is something that has existed for generations, and now that sense is being lost in the breaking or the non-existence of the covenant, that Luke is not continuing the tradition of his forefathers, and that also feels representative of a moment, if you like, of historical crisis, isn't it? A moment of almost the coming of the modern. And in the letter that Wordsworth writes to Charles James Fox. He sort of frames the poem in this way, doesn't he? He talks about the rise of industrialization, the rise of cities, those themes we see in the preface to lyrical ballads as well. And I think that's another element that has interested a lot of the learners this week, sort of Wordsworth as a political poet. And I thought that I might just say a little bit about that, because this is what my main research has been on, really, when I've worked on Wordsworth. Certainly my first two books were. And I was interested that for a number of people, this sort of came as this was causing a reassessment of Wordsworth for them. They thought it was all, well, one person used what they were admitting was the unfair term. They thought Wordsworth was all sort of chocolate boxy daffodils, but now they were realizing that there was much more to his poetry. And I suppose the key point for me is, I do think of Wordsworth as, an inherently political poet, and someone who sees his own role as political, both sort of directly and indirectly. So I think he writes 4 political tracts through the course of his career, doesn't he? Probably the best known of which is the one that's not published, on basically on the French Revolution, which is a very radical, revolutionary, indeed republican tract. We then see through the course of his career, he moves, broadly speaking, from a more radical left-wing position to what we might think of as a more conservative position, but is again writing a number of tracts during that time. There's quite a large part of Wordsworth's poetry which is directly political as well. I'm thinking of the sonnets he writes during the invasion crisis, and then during the war with France. And then he's also not afraid to make interventions on public issues, the most famous probably being the moment when he comes to, when there's the threat of the railways. I think it's in the mid-1840s, isn't it? 1844, I think. Threat of the railways going right through the Lake District from Windermere to Kendal. And he writes to the newspapers there, as well as writing political poetry against that development. So we can see him, I think, as constantly throughout his career really invested in what we think of as politics, using his poetry and other forms of writing to address that. There's a terrific, Jeff and I a few years ago worked on an exhibition about Wordsworth, War and Waterloo, and one of the phrases we picked out there was from one of Wordsworth's tracts, which was his statement that he'd combated for strongholds in the imagination. And I think he had this very strong sense of himself as fighting for the imaginations of his readers. So not working as a sort of, I think as Frank has said in the comment, not as an investigative journalist, but as someone whose writing does have particular power. So I hope people find that sense of Wordsworth as a political poet, an interesting idea. But I wonder, Jeff, do you have any thoughts about that sense of, obviously we've tended in the course and other work we've done to focus on, if you like, the radical Wordsworth, to use the title of Jonathan Bates' recent book. And that's how the sort of the Dove Cottage Wordsworth sort of feels to us. Do you think that just completely sort of disappears as he becomes more conservative, or how do you view his developing political trajectory?
Well, there's a tendency, isn't there, I think, particularly when you mention about the railways, that Wordsworth he may have been, if you like, for the labouring classes, but it was the labouring classes of the Lake District. It was the rural, that his primary focus was. And I was sort of interested in researching for something else that I was doing recently, to think about his, if you like, his defence of the urban labouring classes. And I think you'll perhaps know this better than both of you, but the lines in The Excursion where he talks about, is it the young boy that's got sort of the cotton raiment on his clothing? He spent his time in the mill, and that's the air he's breathing in. So that would be the mid-1810s, wouldn't it? 1814. And then later on, when it comes to the poor law, it's interesting. Again, we all think of him as becoming conservative, but I wonder if that conservative is born of his experiences in the revolution. He's seen the horrors of the revolution, and what he doesn't want, maybe by the time the Reform Act comes out in 32, is the urban working classes being roused up to produce something that's actually bad for everybody. It wouldn't just be the ruling classes that would suffer, but he's seen everybody suffering. And when it comes to the poor law, in 1834, 1834. He writes a poem, Humanity, and this is at the time when the slave trade has just ended, and people, I guess, would be congratulating themselves at ending one form of tyranny. And Wordsworth says, you know, in this poem, which I would encourage, if you don't know it, to look at, something like, shame that our laws at distance still protect enormities, which they at home reject. Slaves cannot breathe in England, yet that boast is but a mockery, when from coast to coast, though fettered slave be none, her floors and soil groan underneath a weight of slavish toil for the poor many. That sounds like the opposite of a political statement, doesn't it? But he also ends by talking about the wealth of nations, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and he said that we're driven by a thirst so keen is ever urging on the vast machine of sleepless labour, the vast machine of sleepless labour, mid whose dizzy wheels the power least prized is that which thinks and feels, which takes us right back to early Wordsworth, helping people to see, think and feel. He's still writing about that same aim, isn't he, 30 years later? But also the sense that with the workhouse, with the poor law, that people are punished for being poor, and families are split up, and it's like it's your fault if you're poor. And again, that might resonate with some of us today. You know, it's not society's fault; it's your fault, and you're going to pay for it by going to the workhouse.
That's very interesting. Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, I mean that gives us the continuity, as you say, from the Wordsworth of the 1790s right through to the 1830s. I'm sorry, I may have come in a bit abruptly there. It's just because what struck me was how a number of commentators this week have talked about parallels between, as you say, issues of poverty in Michael and current issues of ongoing poverty, and they've really stressed that sense that, yeah, for them Michael still feels like a relevant poem. In fact, someone made the brilliant point that maybe we should send it back to Parliament. Also, just worth noting, as you're talking about Wordsworth and slavery, I mean, he's very critical of it in the prelude, isn't it? Can you remember the phrase he uses? He uses a terrific phrase.
He does.
Yeah,
and we're all struggling to remember it.
Yeah,
he does. I mean, I think later on, you know, the later Wordsworth, he was obviously never in favour of slavery, but later on, he's saying, well, actually, there are as great things.
Yeah,
you know, I think he's saying, you know, and one of these issues, I think, is one of them. You know, it's just one of many that need to be tackled.
Absolutely, yeah. Great, thank you. I mean, another topic which people have been very interested in, is another area of kind of Wordsworthian controversy, if you like, is the relationship with Coleridge. Seen, you know, both in terms of the history of Christabel and its last-minute exclusion from lyrical ballads, and then enacted in the fascinating document that Sally talked us through, in which we have the sort of the graffiti over the top of Coleridge's text. So, Sally, do you want to give us your take on that relationship, and then Jeff or I might come in response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's both a very productive and a very destructive relationship, and it's clearly, you know, really important to both of them, especially when they're young. But like any close relationship, it's sort of too intense to maintain itself, I guess. Or they're, I mean, in a way, you know, that they're both very, very talented and you know, extraordinary individuals, but maybe they just can't bear to have too much of each other. I don't know. They're too competitive in a way. So I think even though I'm a Wordsworthian, not a Coleridgean, I think it would be, you'd have to say it's more, the relationship's more damaging to Coleridge than to Wordsworth. So when they first meet, Coleridge actually is more famous than Wordsworth, so he's sort of giving Wordsworth a leg up, sort of helping him into the literary world. But then obviously over time, Wordsworth becomes more successful and achieves more, and his personality type is, you know, healthier, shall we say. You know, he's very focused on what he needs to do, what he wants to get done, and very productive. Whereas Coleridge once he's decided not to be a preacher, which he was going to be, which would have maybe given him stability in life, who knows. He does have a very unstable sense of self. I always think with Coleridge, the annoying thing about Coleridge is he is a really great poet. I mean, he's a fantastic poet. He's such a good poet. But the minute he meets Wordsworth, he's just saying, the great God Wordsworth, I can never measure up to him. It sort of, he recognises Wordsworth's abilities, but at his own expense. And he didn't need to do that. He's a different kind of poet. He has different kinds of abilities. So Coleridge sort of almost gives up poetry, I think, because of Wordsworth, and shifts to philosophy. So intellectually, they have quite a problematic relationship. We said before, Coleridge is always setting challenges for Wordsworth. This is what you should be doing. It's often things that Coleridge really ought to be doing, but he can't get on with it. Wordsworth doesn't really want to do it because that's not quite what he had in mind, So that's in some ways helpful, in some ways not. And then obviously their personal life, which is where the focus of much interest lies, is also problematic. So they're very close. Then Coleridge goes off to Malta, and when he returns, there's a sort of almost, again, tragic account by Dorothy of not recognizing him. Mm-hmm. And she says he came back, and they sort of had to do a double take because he changed so much. He looked so different. And obviously he's become really addicted to opium in that period. And I always thought that was really sad. There's something really sad about that. And that marks a key shift in their relationship. From then on, Coleridge, they actually are helping Coleridge a lot, giving him somewhere to stay, looking after him, helping through his various marital troubles. And then in 1810, there's this sort of big rift when Wordsworth says something to someone who repeats it when they shouldn't. We've all been there. And Coleridge is then sort of really damaged by that and moves away. So it is a fascinating relationship, isn't it? I mean, it's such a great story at so many levels. I think there are two books that I really like on that, which are quite old books now, but they're still really good. Lucy Newlyn, The Language of Illusion, is a great book where she looks at how their relationship plays out through literary borrowings from each other and so on, which is a bit like what I was doing with Manuscripts, but different. And also Paul Magnuson's book called Wordsworth and Coleridge, A Lyrical Dialogue, which again sort of reads their relationship through the text as well. I think those are both really good books if you're interested in it.
Oh, thank you. I mean, there's an Adam Sisman book as well, isn't there?
I haven't read that, so I don't. Yeah.
Which is good, yeah. I mean, Jeff, I don't know if you want to come in on that, but I mean, I suppose one of the things that's quite interesting is, or very interesting is, the problems with Christabel and so on are happening in 1800, aren't they? But even in 1804, when he's going to Malta, the Wordsworth are involved, as you were telling us a couple of weeks ago, in this incredible sort of labour of love, aren't they? Producing a copy of the Prelude for him. So he's still an enormously important figure for them.
He is, and thinking about our new exhibition, it begins with the Goslar letter, and there's William and Dorothy sending poems to Coleridge because they want his opinion. He matters so much. That's almost like an early labour of love. And then the Malta Notebook, even more so. I mean, they do sort of they do make up, don't they? In 1812, I think it is. But it never goes back, does it? It never goes back to that closeness. And I guess you've got a bit of follow on, haven't you, with the Biographia Literaria, where Coleridge tells his side of the story. So it goes on and it goes on, doesn't it? Yeah. But I mean, you say, that there's Coleridge is the better known, as it were, of the two. I mean, it must have been something for a young Wordsworth to have this better known poet say to you, you are the great poet of the age. I mean, that must have been quite something to take on. To live with that for the next few years.
I mean, as Sally says, two complex but very different personalities who, for a period of, well, I guess it's only about 4 years in their sort of interrelation, even less maybe, are responsible for the production of some of the greatest poetry we have in the English language. And then, I mean, though the relationship continues, that period of sort of mutual sort of stimulation doesn't really continue after that to the same extent. Great, thank you.
So even then, the account of writing the Rime of the Ancient Mariner which Wordsworth gives in the notes, is it? Where is that account? I think is fantastic read, because it just tells you all you need to know. That they tried to write it together, and even that first night they realised there's no way we're going to be able to write it literally together. So yeah, that sense of sort of definitely sparking off each other and stimulating each other, but also having a very different take on what they were doing.
And I just think if people want to look at sort of one of the nicest moments in which the relationship is captured, I'll maybe see if I can put the line references on the comments section to this film when it's out. It's just that Wordsworth's reminiscences at the end of the prelude of him and Coleridge walking on the Quantock Hills and sharing their ideas about their poetry, and you get a real sense there of how productive the relationship was.
I think I was just going to say something if I could, that some of the Coleridge's comments on Wordsworth in this Biographia Literaria, which 1818, if I get that right, is where he says, Wordsworth's great thing is it lifts the familiarity of our lives by showing us the wonders and the beauty of nature, and that's as good a criticism of Wordsworth as it were, that you could get, really, and that's well after this sort of falling out as we talk about.
Fantastic, thank you. One final topic I'd like to broach with you both is the issue of how difficult manuscripts can sometimes be to read. So this is an experience a number of our learners have had this week in looking at the cross-written manuscript we supplied them with. And I'm obviously not I'm not a manuscript scholar, but we're lucky enough to have a curator who works with manuscripts, whose job it is to make them available to the public, and then a scholar who specialises in manuscript work. Jeff, I wonder if I might come to you first. Obviously, as someone who works with a lot of groups and looks at manuscripts, is this something that gets easier? Is it a skill? Is it a matter of time, or does it remain difficult for everybody?
The first reaction people often give, and you've seen it too, is because I'll never read that. How does anybody ever read that? And we're talking, aren't we, sometimes about manuscripts that have been written over. We're talking about letters, where to save paper, the letters written in 3 or 4 different directions, and people that can't do that. And quite funny, really. I was talking to a group, would you believe, of doctors' receptionists on occasion, and they could all read it perfectly because
I was going to say that.
They were used to. That's what they were used to.
Exactly. Yeah.
We'll each have our different ways of doing this, but I think there's 2 things. Is if you think of the creation of it in the first place, and you almost get into the mindset of the person writing it in terms of the speed in which it was written. This is a hurried scrawl, or it's a very careful. And if I was writing this in a hurried way, well, what are the other hurried words on this page that look like, and to sort of get into the flow of it and to read further ahead. So try to get the gist and then go back. And then there's the painstaking way, isn't there, of saying, well, there's a B. That's how he does a B. So could that be a B in this difficult way? But I suppose working with groups, I would always say sort of get the flow and then work out the detail kind of thing, because you then don't you, sort of get into the use of the vocabulary almost of the person, and then this is a word they're kind of likely to use. But that's my working with groups. Sally, you do it in a much more detailed way in terms of.
I'm not that good at it. I co-edited with Jim Butler, and he was much better at it than I was. Although he'd done earlier volumes, so he was more familiar with that. I think the general point, the basic point you make about the receptionists is really true. So, I used to mark for A-level papers and hundreds of these things, and GCSEs, and obviously Simon and I still mark student essays. So you don't even think that you have a skill there, but actually you do, because you're very used to reading, being able to read quite difficult, a range of different hands quite quickly. So you do have a certain natural skill of it, like your receptionist. I think for me, if you're editing, then you're often looking at different versions of a text. So you do have a framework. So you'll have like the previous version, the previous draft, and the next draft, and the next draft. So you do have something to go on. And obviously where you get caught out is where there's a bit that didn't make it into the next draft and wasn't in the previous draft. And as Jeff says, you kind of whittle that down then, and you'll get down to there'll be one word that you just can't get. And then it is just basically, it is a best guess looking at the shape of the lettering and so on. And there are bits in Cornell when I've worked with other Cornell volumes where and done it alongside the manuscript where I've spotted things that I like, no, that I know what that isn't the word that's in the Cornell. So I mean, even Cornell is not perfect because at some point it's just the best guess. It is a bit of those brain tricks as well, though, because you can kind of look at it really, really closely and enlarge it and not get it at all, and then you go away, and if you come back to it, you'll suddenly see it. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. I mean, there's a few shortcuts. So there's always the ampersand that I use a lot. That's what I always tell the students is because William and Dorothy's hand is surprisingly similar. That always surprised me because you'd think it would be gendered and they'd look quite different, but they don't. They look really similar at certain stages. But they do a different and. So William does like a long knot, a line with a knot in the middle, and Dorothy does a horizontal ampersand. So that I always tell students that they love that because then you know for sure when you hit the ampersand pretty much. Okay, it's definitely William or it's definitely Dorothy, stuff like that. So there's a few shortcuts. But.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for sharing those tips. And I know that, as I say, lots of the learners have been really fascinated by all the manuscript work that we've done throughout the course. So that's great. Just before we finish, I wanted to ask you both about a couple of projects that are either sort of happening soon or have just completed. So Sally, I mean, you've got a new book out which is about the lyrical ballads. So perhaps you could just tell our learners about that.
Time for a shameless plug. Well, no, because I've got my weird backstrap on. There it is. It's Cambridge Companion to Lyrical Ballads. I don't know if you can see it. There you go.
Yeah.
And it's in hardback and paperback at quite a reasonable price on Amazon, and it's dedicated to Jeff.
And that was one of the most honoured I've ever felt. Thank you, Sally. Thank you so much for that.
Long deserved it. Harder.
It's a great. I can sing its praises, can't I? Because I've got nothing to do with it. But it's a great collection of essays by the leading scholars in the field, and we'll cover. People who've done the course and enjoyed the course will find an awful lot in it of value and of interest, I think. Jeff, I just wanted you to. I mean, suddenly there's all sorts of Wordsworthian things happening, most of which are coming out of Dove Cottage and Wordsworth Grasmere. I wondered if you just wanted to tell our learners about some of the events that are happening very soon.
It seems to be happening all at once. We've got the BBC here this weekend doing an edition of Front Row. We've got Simon Armitage reading Wordsworth in Dove Cottage tomorrow, which I can't remember the date when it goes live, but people can. Do you remember?
Thursday the 1st, yeah, Thursday the 1st. That goes live. We've put it on the site, but we'll flag it up again. So
tickets available for that, at a very, very reasonable price. This Sunday, we're featured on Countryfile. So there's a really strong Wordsworth element to Countryfile this coming Sunday, and I think we've even got a review of Dove Cottage Garden in the Financial Times. So if any learners are gardening specialists, Financial Times on Saturday, I believe it's due to come out. But also we're beginning a 6-part series, Simon and I, of In Conversation with Wordsworthians. And Sally, you're coming up, I think, towards the end of the series, but we begin with Jonathan Bate and we begin with Stephen Gill. So the authors of the two great biographies, I would say. Can I say that? Perhaps I've missed one out. I apologise. Anyway, the authors of two great biographies that have come out this year. And I guess we would, the three of us would encourage any learners who have questions that they would like to put to them. In addition to what we've talked about, or perhaps get a better answer from those two than we've been able to give. But we'll be putting those questions to them, and they're starting in October. So Jonathan Bate and Stephen Gill, the first two.
Fantastic. So when I think we have now got all the details of those. So again, we'll make those available to learners either through the comments or something like that if they want to find them out. Yeah, so plenty of opportunities. Once this course finishes, next week is the last week, sadly, for people to continue their engagement with Wordsworth and with others. And certainly it will be very interesting to ask people like Jonathan Bate and Stephen Gill say about their take on the Wordsworth-Coleridge relationship and see if it same as ours or different. Fantastic. Well, thank you both very much for giving up your time and your ideas. It's been great fun as ever to talk to you. Thanks again to the two mentors who do such a great job throughout the week. That's Andrew and Frank. And thanks to everyone who's made it this far through what's been quite a long recording. We hope it's been worthwhile. We hope you've enjoyed it. Next week, we will be returning to Grasmere, very much a focus on Grasmere. We're thinking particularly about Dorothy Wordsworth, and we're also hoping to come up with a particular treat for you, an unexpected surprise, which we haven't finally resolved yet. But as soon as we've got information on that, I will let you know. But we hope you have a good weekend, and we look forward to seeing you next week for week 4. So thanks very much, and goodbye to Sally and Jeff.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye to you all. Bye-bye.